So what we're going to talk about here, which dovetails into the longest intro and bio ever, Adam's history with publishing deals and publishing finance deals, and mine as well. So I'm on the legal side. I'm a lawyer. I run a firm called the Interactive Entertainment Law Group in Los Angeles. We're probably the largest,
full screen,
or if not one of the largest law firms devoted to the games industry.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
What am I doing here?
Full screen.
There we go. So what we're going to talk about today is the different publisher financing models that are out there for development studios, and how they're structured, pros and cons of each one. And I think before you can really evaluate which one you're going to be doing, or which one you're going to prefer, you really need to assess your project, assess your studio, and what you're going to need out of a publisher. And I think that ties into what Adam was saying about the needs and the wants slide in there. So, but Adam, talk about the things that you would look at when you're evaluating what kind of publishing deal or structure you might even be
I mean, it depends on so many different aspects, right? How is your cash flow doing? How is your business doing? Sort of what are your prospects for other projects happening at the same time? How, the word thirsty, how thirsty are you? The thirstier you are, and if the other side detects that, that's bad. That's a bad scene, because then they're going to try to sort of change the terms. So it's about, if you have one concept, why did you make the concept? Does it resonate, right? What kind of concept is it? Was it built with a commercial product in mind, or were you just like, I want to make this amazing artistic thing and then hopefully get signed? So there's a lot of things that factor into that discussion, and even the responsiveness from publishers out there and business partners that could potentially fund. So there are a ton of things that go into it. What is the scope? How big is it? Are you talking to the right people? Oftentimes, publishers have different groups that fund different sizes of projects. For example, my team in third party, we didn't really fund a lot of stuff. We built a new third party production group at PlayStation that sort of funded small things. But often people would come into us and be like, I've got this $40 million project. And we're like, we're not the right people. Well, can you hear us out anyway? Ironically, I'm going to PlayStation next week to pitch a project that's outside their budget. But that's important to know who you're talking to, and if they're the right people that can make the decisions.
And look, when you sort of evaluate your project, again, this is meant to be before you approach publishers. The answer might be yes, I just need their money, or no, I don't need them at all. Whether you need a publisher at all, I think is an entirely different panel, which we can have that discussion. But before approaching the publishers and before you start evaluating the models, I think this is a good exercise for all the developers out there, and for all the lawyers too. I try to do this at my firm with all of our clients, is say, what are we trying to accomplish here before you just go the shotgun approach and talk to a publisher that you know is only going to offer this kind of deal, or only offers this kind of value that you may not even be looking for.
And on top of that, I think it's important to have a point of view and a sort of what you want, right? What is your preference for a deal, but also be flexible, but in that flexibility not being too flexible. I know that's kind of a weird juxtaposition. Have a perspective like, here's what kind of deal we're looking for, but in the back of your mind being like, we could settle for these other things. But as soon as somebody would be like, what about a crowdfund that we pivot to, publishing deal? And then they don't go like, yeah, that sounds great. It sounds great. Where do we sign, right? You want to have a perspective that you think is going to work, even with business model of how you're going to commercialize your product. Is it going to be free to play? Is it going to be premium, stuff like that? Being somewhat open, but having a point of view, I think, is also important.
So assuming you go through this assessment, and you're going to determine whether you can or can't self-publish, or whether you should, and you decided that a publisher is right for you because they're going to tick off some of the boxes on the game that you're making, then different models and different publishers have different sort of proclivities. Yeah.
What's the range of finance you generally find for these games? What's the range you're talking about?
I mean, as far as dollar amount?
Yeah, dollar.
Oh, it can literally be, a marketing commitment of, a sort of a soft dollar up to $50 or $75 million. I mean, it could be anything. And that also depends on sort of the ongoing responsibilities post-launch, whether it's, there's live ops and downloadable content or ongoing content. But I would say external third-party deals, you're probably not getting more than a 30, the high end, maybe a $30 or $40 million commitment?
No, I think there's bigger ones now. I think it's a different world than it was, say, even 5 or 10 years ago, where I think the biggest challenge actually is the mid-range. Yeah. Right now, the hardest projects to sign are between like let's say 3.5, more like 5 to 15 million are the hardest. which I call sort of the Midway and THQ world that they played in, those kind of budgets. Ironically, I feel like a lot of games right now that are coming out of Steam are sort of ending up in that dev range, but those are that's a weird spot for big publishers to play around with. So usually sub 5 million, sub 3 million, and then ironically, once you get north of 20, it's sort of like a rounding error, 20, 30, 50, 70, depending. I mean, obviously, if you're a big, huge studio with a big name, I think when Bonfire started up with Rob Pardo and Min Kim and those guys, and they were valued without a game at $100 million, that's, I think, on the tall scale of it. But it all depends. And then with that, too, is having a point of view of how do you want the rights to sort of live. I think Bungie with Destiny did a great job on sort of retaining some rights for them as a studio. And then obviously Activision has a lot of the commercial aspects of that. So it all depends. But obviously once you get north of 20 million, you better be ready because they're going to come with, the rubber gloves and everything to find out, whether you could actually accomplish it. Sub 5 mil, I think, is where there's a lot more playroom. But yeah, those are sort of the scales.
Yeah, they're really big ones. They don't grow on trees. They don't give them out to startups with a proven track record or a pedigree. Even if it's a new studio, the principles have better come from something that was very successful.
Yeah, I think I want to sort of touch on this one too, because the self-publishing, self-finance, crowdfund, the most important thing I think is asking questions. I think too many studios and developers just sort of like think all they need to do is brainstorm as a team to figure this out. And there is everyone on the planet that has been successful in the games industry. I mean, there's one thing that bonds us all, right? Hopefully, which is video games, and some passion at some point for that. And through that, I think, is this sort of need to have togetherness. And what I've found is that in every way, shape, and form, if you go up to somebody that has had success or done a deal with a certain partner in the past or has negotiated with something, they will have all the time in the world to share that insight with you. And so I think nobody's in it alone. And I think that's one of the biggest things that people sort of miss. The important thing is, can you self-finance? Can you self-publish? Stuff that we have on the slide here is important. We've seen most Kickstarters and crowdfunded games that put up a number fail dismally at actually shipping the game for that budget, which basically is because very few game developers that I know went to business school, right? Most of them started to make games. And inherently, they're just not built to know the commercial impact of how to ship a game. And so that's very important when you're working with clients or as a developer of like, can we actually get it out? And then once it is out, can we afford to float it for 6 months, patch the game as we're trying to chase the consumers and sort of where they're going to be spending their money?
Yeah, and to be honest, most development studios tend to be run by the most experienced developer in that studio, the best coder, the best designer, whatever. And he or she generally doesn't have a significant business background unless they've shipped tons and tons of games. And they're looking at the budget and they're looking at their ask of publishers as how can I get from point A to point B on just producing this game. They're not looking at the marketing, they're not looking at the testing, they're not looking at sort of all the live ops after the fact. So all of that doesn't always factor into their approach. It certainly doesn't always factor in their budget very well.
Yeah,
there's exceptions. Obviously, the more experienced developers and shipped a lot of games, like Adam, who've been on the other side of the equation, I think certainly can navigate through that. But a lot of the indie clients that we have certainly they don't think it through that way.
I was on an independent developer panel at GDC about 6 years ago, and Jonathan Blow was on it. He was the gentleman that made Braid and then The Witness, and at the time he had just shipped Braid. And we were talking about what's the best case scenario as an independent developer to try to raise funds. And he said, just live in your parents' basement for 4 years and make it on your own, because that'll be your best case scenario. And he was like dead serious. He looked at the crowd. He's like, just do that. And I was like, how many people have 4 years of rent saved up in the bank account right now to be able to do this? And one guy put up his hand. And John Blow looked at me like, why are you? I'm like, because that's not realistic. I mean, I'm a grown-ass man, 21 years in the games industry, and we're still schlepping for dollars. I mean, that's the reality of it, right? Very few developers have the ability to be able to fund their own stuff. So it's important that when you're looking at different deals, like what suits your studio best.
So again, what is it that you need the most? No, sorry, go ahead.
I was just wondering if you could give us just some basics of what a traditional publishing deal looks like.
Yeah, we're one slide away. One slide. We'll get to that.
So again, before you approach the publishers, before you sort of say what a traditional deal looks like, sort of assess what you're going to need out of the deal. And again, I think it ties perfectly back to Adam's slide about oxygen and boats, right? I mean, it's what do you need to get from point A to point B, and what do you really want out of your partnerships? That's not necessarily out of your singular production, but out of your entire relationship.
Yeah, it's not just getting it out the door. Getting a game out the door, people think is the biggest battle, and that's not at all. It's really what happens when the game's out in the wild, right? How do you build a robust marketing sort of campaign? How do you build a social media campaign? Do you have the right support from the different publishers? Perfect example is a game Inside came out, right, from Playdead, the guys who made Limbo, and it came out on Xbox One as an exclusive deal. And it sort of was critically acclaimed, but didn't move a lot of units. And so that's a good example of, like, they probably weren't thinking and talking and negotiating about where's the placement going to be on the store, how long is it going to be on that page for, how many click-throughs can you guarantee, all that sort of, the more commercial aspects of it. So, because again, most people are like, I just want to make my dream game, and the dream game comes out, I was like, how come nobody likes it? I tweeted about it. Like, because that's not how you do things in the modern era.
All right, so now once you've figured all that out, once you know what you're sort of seeking, then what do the deals tend to look like? So, like I said, the very first slide, the traditional publishing model that we see a little bit less and less, but it still certainly exists, is basically that the agreed upon development budget is funded by the publisher to the developer. It's done in installments, sort of on a milestone basis. So there's a deliverable that's submitted. If that's approved, the publisher says, fine, that's great. Here's your payment. And we move on to the next set of deliverables. And that money, that development fee that's given, is an advance against the developer's royalties. So what that ultimately means is that money has to get recouped by the publisher when the revenues start coming in from the game. And the way it gets recouped in this model is as your percentage. So because it's recouped against your royalty percentage, it tends to mean that you don't get to a royalty in 95% of the cases. Yeah. Maybe more. But this deal has its advantages. It's the traditional old school way. When I first started in the business 18 years ago, this is the only way deals were done. And they're still done this way to a certain point. The question is what the publisher is responsible for besides the money. Certainly there's production oversight. They're usually going to be responsible for all of the marketing and the testing. Back when it was a retail product, it was all the packaging and the sales component. So there are certainly advantages to this deal from a developer standpoint, and the biggest advantage is obviously your game's funded. But with those advantages come some strings.
Yeah, I think the biggest advantage is you're employed.
Yeah.
But you're not necessarily self-employed. The challenge with these ones is that on top of the development budget, let's say a scenario where the game was a $10 million budget in that weird black hole area. So $10 million budget, the publisher on top is going to spend, let's say sometimes they spend between 20 and 50% on marketing, right? So let's say they're going to spend $5 million on it. So now you're at $15 million. Plus what they're going to be doing is baking in the entire production and management overhead costs internally, plus their office rental, plus legal fees, plus everything else baked into that too. So you're going to add another probably 30 to 50%. So now you're at 20 million to recoup. And then on top of that, there's the chargebacks, there's the insurance. Like when you're talking about a physically distributed product, they also want a bunch of protections, which I call the kitchen sink shit, which goes in there too, which obviously from their perspective, they want to recoup. But when you're sort of recouping at, let's say a 5 or 7 or 8, who knows what percentage that is, recoup, right? You're talking about you're not going to make your money back until they've made $100 million or $120, $140 million. And then oftentimes they want to add and then we also want a 30% profit margin into it, right? So by the end of it, at Capcom, we sort of switched the model a little bit. And I was proud that out of 18 products that we did, all external where we own the IPs, actually 2 of them we didn't own the IPs, but the other ones we did, we paid out royalties on 16 of the 18. And that was sort of a point of pride for us because we want to make sure it was fair and balanced. And our perspective was once we're flush, I had a great conversation with a developer one time, and I said, you guys have been quite successful in participating in huge IPs in the actual revenues. How have you done that? And he goes, his negotiating tactic, he goes, sits down with the publisher and said, at what point are you guys popping Cristal? Because at that point, I want to take my team to McDonald's for some burgers. How do we get that into the contract? And I think that's a good sort of methodology of like when there's a happy place where you guys are like, you know, buying boats and stuff like that from the executive team, how can the developer get a little bit of that too? And I think that's why, to Patrick's point, we're migrating away from this, because as an independent developer at this point, just get bought as a studio, and then you're just working on the next big thing anyway, because there just is so little upside aside from stability and longevity in your studio. And at that point, chances are you didn't start your own company to just do a deal like this.
And even the stability, which is one of the biggest sales points or advantages of this deal, your stability is not really even there, because your entire cash flow is dependent on those approvals. So every month you submit an approval, they've usually got 10 days to approve it or disapprove it, and then after that there's another 10 or 20 days before they have to pay, and a lot of these publishers pay late or pay in the very last day. So every month you have at least 20 to 45 days before you get paid for the work you just did. So and on top of that, it's not necessarily steady, because they can pull the plug at any time, not just because you didn't do your job. These deals tend to have an at-will termination right by the publisher. So yes, you've got some guaranteed work, but it's only really guaranteed on a month-to-month basis, no matter what the contract says.
Yeah, and then on top of that, you're sort of then beholden to whoever the management production team is at the publisher, which could change on a whim. We've had many projects where we've had 12 different producers over a 2-year cycle, right? And on top of that, I think it's just you are totally at the whim. How many companies do you think, Patrick, have gone under when this contract ceased? Like, how many placed their entire development team at that cycle and were able to afford a 3 month of trying to find 3 to 9 months of trying to find it? I mean,
I would say when a publisher kills a deal, even on an at-will basis, certainly for breach.
because you usually get current plus next.
Right, it's almost like severance payment, right? They'll say it's not you, it's me, and here's a month of your studio burn rate. So
Good luck placing 100 people in 1 month.
Right.
Good luck with that.
I would say on a one-team studio, on a development studio that only works on this one title, it's pretty much a death blow 90% of the time.
Yeah.
I only know, actually the only one that comes to mind that survived it was one, ironically, that somebody that I know very well in the industry killed from a developer of mine.
It's true.
Yeah, that's the only one that survived that I can recall.
Thanks, Patrick. That was not.
And you did that right? I mean, that was well done. It was one of those ones where the publisher and the developer just weren't seeing eye to eye in the production. It wasn't turning out the way it wanted. They could have probably said, like in most of these deals, it's not a
breach of milestone.
It's a breach. And we don't even have to pay you.
Yeah.
But Adam and the publisher that he was working for at the time said, no, we know that would be a death blow, so we want to give you a lifeline. We want to give you a chance, and because they know that their lifeblood is working with developers, and they didn't want that to come back. So, but most of the time, it's really difficult.
Yeah, and this is actually the model. We've built our structured Iron Galaxy to combat this model completely, right? We've purposely not had a 1 or 2 team. Like with 120 people, you could probably run 2 huge teams at the same time. We are at any one time working on between 10 and 15 projects, because that way we have the ability to deploy things. And to date, we have never had a layoff in 8.5 years. And that's because of that sort of we call it the Tetris game all the time of resources and stuff like that. But that's something I'm very proud of. And that's one of the reasons why I left PlayStation to come here, because that sort of combating this model is super important.
Yeah, I mean, you have to look at production almost like a bell curve, right? You start with a couple people, and at the height of production, you go up to whatever 40, 50, 100 people on your title. And then on the downside, you start rolling them off and putting them on different projects. At any point in that bell curve, if the publisher cuts it, however many people are at that bell curve at that point have no work, and you have to keep paying them. So usually there's layoffs, and if that's the only income you have, then it usually is basically shutting down the whole studio. The other thing that I think is important here is how few developers really understand the back end and the recoup component here, and how unlikely it is that they're going to receive it. I was working for a publisher once, and the deal was about ready to be signed. And the developer got us on the phone and said, "Okay, look, we're all ready to go. We agreed on these last things, but can you just see in your good heart to bump the royalty from 10 to 15%, because we're really we don't have a whole lot of margin on the production side, and we think we believe in the project, and we want to see some upside on the other end." So we put him on hold. We looked at the P&L report and we started laughing hysterically because they weren't going to get to a royalty even if we gave them 50%. Right? They just weren't going to get there because we knew about how many games it was going to sell, our units was going to sell. We knew our cost structure and the way the deal was set up. Just was never going to get there. So we got back on the phone
And you laughed at them?
Well, no, on hold. We laughed. But
That's trifling.
and then we got off hold, and then we said, you twisted our arm, fine, we'll give you 15%. And they thought
That's a give.
that was a give, and that was a gratuitous give,
Yeah,
which
that was
you're
nice.
never supposed to do.
Very nice of you. Give them nothing.
Right, and they made no royalty on it, right? But that's the model, and most developers don't understand that. If you're banking on a deal because of the back end in this type of structure, you're dead, right? It's not going to work. So make your money on the production. A lot of developers will pad the budget that they're getting by what's the normal 10, 15% padding?
Yeah.
Okay. So some try to squeeze a little bit more out of it, and that's where your money's made because you can't assume you're going to make it on a royalty percentage based on sales. So it's a $10 million project might only cost you $9 million in actual costs, and you've made $1 million. It's not that $1 million going in your pocket, and you're the ones popping the crystal. That's your rainy day fund.
You're popping yellowtail.
Right.
If you're lucky. But in that one too, I think it's important. Like that's just margin-based service business.
Right.
And again, most people didn't start their own development studio to be in the margin-based service business because it's low margin. It's really not. Like if you're just doing only those deals all the time, and you don't have some grandfather deal from the olden days that gets you awesomely paid, then it's
So what's sort of sprung from that traditional model is now what I call sort of a break-even model, right? Almost identical in structure. Publisher pays in advance, and it's usually a deliverable-based system. Same problems with cash flow and approvals and payments. But instead of recouping all those slew of costs and everything against your low percentage, your 10%, so you need to make $100 million, when the game breaks even on all of its associated costs, at the break-even point, you start sharing in revenue. So it's a much more achievable threshold or much more achievable barrier to, or bar to get over on that. I think this started, at least from my experience, this started in the mobile deals, and I think has sort of now been a little bit more pervasive on some of the larger deals.
Well, I think, it also came from, I think, just a sway of honesty coming across the industry. Like, I remember when we were at Capcom, all the deals we would do when we were at this point is we bring the developer in. I'll never forget, with Certain Affinity, Max Hoberman, we brought him into the studio and we basically put up the Excel sheet of exactly the deal, and at what point do you recoup, at what point do we recoup, at what point do we make this much money and they make that much money, and basically worked on the Excel file together live. And I think that's sort of where this sort of was born from, of like, give me more visibility into what's happening, let me understand more clearly. Oftentimes they'll bake in, like, now they're calling it's like the Hollywood model, which is like bake in 30%, so they make 130%, let's say, and then you make some money. But this is a lot more common nowadays.
Yeah, and the other thing that I think that sort of brought this model on is not just fairness, but the ability to self-publish, right? It sort of made the leverage shift a little bit in the developer's favor, where they couldn't necessarily walk away from their traditional deal because that was all that was out there. Now all of a sudden you're saying I can self-publish on Xbox Live, whether you want to or not is a different issue. I can self-publish on mobile. I don't need to fit into your traditional recoup against my advanced model. And then the publisher started to say, well, okay, you're right. Let's do something that's a little bit more fair, so you don't go that route, and we have partners to work with.
Yeah, and on top of that, because these terms are a little bit more fair, there's often more asks in IP ownership, sequel rights, digital, basically participation in digital revenue, maybe even PC revenue, stuff like that. Like, let's say they're funding one SKU, and they're like, hey, let me give a little piece of the PC SKU, something like that, to sort of offset the fact that it is more fair than the traditional model.
And the other thing I think is important in this, because it tends to occur in games with sort of post-launch responsibilities, live ops and downloadable content, things like that. The break-even isn't a static number. The break-even might be 10 million, but a month later, when you pump more marketing in it, then you're back underwater, right? So the break-even, some months you're over it, and some months you're not. because the publisher's still spending against that. So that they just keep putting stuff into that bucket. So it's not like once you hit this flat number, every dollar over that you share in, because the more they start spending against it, then the more that number sort of varies.
And that's where I always recommend to people to put sort of a visibility clause so they can see what plans are happening, and also sort of a not to exceed. So ensuring that on a quarterly basis, you're not going to exceed, let's say, 10% of the whole entire product, budget in spend and sort of promotion. Of course, that's always like a push-pull kind of thing, because oftentimes they can just be like, hey, we did this big event, this cost us $1 million, and now you're not going to recoup because we want more, cha-ching.
And this goes back to the contract. Obviously, as a developer, you want to have as much visibility on it as possible. If you can get approvals, great. I think that's not necessarily likely on some of these things, but we should at least have some sort of consultation or some sort of oversight into these big spends, because if it's coming out of the break even and coming out of your end, ultimately, you should have some idea of where that money's going.
So ask often, ask early and ask often. Be like, how are we tracking with the costs associated with it? Give us visibility in that. That's super important, because most developers wait, and then 6 months after, like, are we ever going to get? It's like, well, have you ever asked for? Are you tracking any of this stuff? Is there any P&L analysis you're doing? So make sure it's fair to ask that. Be like, hey, this is a partnership. We are tracking costs. We usually have audit rights, yearly audit rights, but you don't want to usually use those. So just say, hey, send me over what you guys have now. Well, then often they'll turtle, and they'll be like, in 9 months, they'll make excuses.
Well, there's two things about that, right? The first one is what you can do under the contract and what you have rights to and what you have visibility in. And the other part is the relationship side, right? If you have a good working relationship on the production side, you can always ask, hey, what are you guys doing on the marketing side? What are the big things that are coming down the pike? Whether the contract says it or not, you're gonna get some of that visibility if you have a good working relationship, and no contract is gonna automatically get it for you. You still have to ask, and you still have to have that. So the four corners of the contract are certainly important, because otherwise they might say, no, we don't have to give you that, and we're not going to. But if you have those rights, you still have to figure out the right way to sort of exercise them.
Many people think that the best way to get their way is to basically like take the snippet tool from Windows and like grab a clause and then email it to their business partner and be like, well, it's in the contract. Never do that ever. If you ever want to like play scorched earth games, start like saying, I'm going to check the contract. Never say that. That's the worst thing ever. Because from a relationship perspective, it's really important about the integrity of that relationship. And you can get to that point, right? It might take a beer, be like, listen, I was looking through it and it looks like, oh, it's in there. But never use that as the first. A lot of people are like, well, I'm just going to, I think it's kind of our also like anonymized Twitter shit-talking society of like, if I just send them this clause, it'll be over. No, you're going to wish you never did, because holy hell is about to come upon you.
I mean, I can't tell you how many times I get calls from our developer clients saying, they're a day late on their approvals, or they haven't paid us and it was due yesterday and they haven't done it yet. Draft a breach letter. No, I'm not going to start a 30-day clock to terminate the agreement over that. Just call the guy, right? And they're like, no, I don't want to call them because they're ignoring me, or they didn't answer the phone when I called them on Friday at 6 o'clock. Okay, you're still not going to get a breach letter, right? And that's my advice. And again, it goes back to the relationship. The contract is certainly important. It's the lifeblood and it's the rule book, but the relationship is at least as important, if not more.
Yeah, treat it more like a marriage than just like a dating scenario.
That's right.
Especially when, as a PlayStation, you're dealing with these big publishers, and they'd be like, well, what if you guys sue us? I'm like, when's the last time PlayStation sued a publisher?
Right.
And they'd be like, well, that makes me feel 0.5% better. But that is important. Like, and understand that the next morning you're gonna wake up and you're still gonna be in partnership with this company. So ensuring that you're trying to do the best every step of the way.
So going back to the break-even model versus the traditional model, everything else about it tends to be the same. The ability for the publisher to terminate on an at-will basis, the severance payment, if you will, all the approvals, ownership, reps and warranties, the level of costs that are baked in might be a little bit more on the break-even model, just because they want to make sure that they're not paying you out before the game's actually making money. But for the most part, these structures are identical, other than the recoup.
Any questions so far about those first two? All right.
Okay. This is one I like. A couple of my clients on the publisher side use it, and a couple of my clients on the developer side have used it. And I think it's worked out really well. So this is what's called a burn rate deal. Effectively, what this one is, it's not tied to a specific deliverable and an approval process. the publisher basically says, what are the costs of running your team of 10 or 20 people? What is your total budget to make payroll, pay rent, keep the lights on? We'll pay you that plus a small, plus a margin every month. And you're going to just keep making this game. And we're going to keep doing it until we get it right together. It doesn't mean they don't have any ability to pull out or have different touch points, but they're just covering all your costs. So if you guys worked on...
Yeah, we do a lot of this stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. We call these also time and materials. So basically you're quoting, usually you quote a higher man-month rate, person-month rate to sort of like say, to, like you said, bake for that. But it's usually sort of like, hey, 6-month basis, you need 3 people to hammer out this one thing. We do quite a bit of this. And it's usually... Ironically, the closer they are to submission, usually the higher the price is, because they're calling us because they're in a pinch, and that's sort of due to poor planning. And we can't expect to just have our 6 best people always waiting for a phone call, like they're in the bat cave. So usually that comes with sort of a penalty or a higher sort of rate. But this is nice just for filling gaps, right? I've seen some people start the companies just doing this kind of stuff. They just want to start with a couple people. Actually, Dave Lang, when he started Iron Galaxy Studios, I hired him when I was at Capcom to help us out with Bionic Commando, just on a burn rate basis. Like, what's your rate? Let's just do a 6-month thing. We're really sort of having trouble with the online side of things, so he went to Sweden with me to help fix that stuff. And then, as we realized how problematic the development was, we were like, hey, we need a couple more people. And soon, I think Capcom basically did the first 3 or 4 game deals with them, and it was like, as they kept proving themselves, like, okay, they grew, and the company grew out of just purely burn rate deals because that gave them enough time. Because every time you add somebody, you know exactly how much margin you're going to be able to bake into it, so that can go into office expenditures and stuff like that. They mostly work from home at the start, but it's a great way to start a company and also build trust with clients. Because now, some of the burn rate deals we started, like, for example, we did some stuff early on with Bethesda. Now we're doing, lots and lots of projects with them. So the more sort of, even with Capcom, it started with one little person for one bit, and then at the peak, I think it was 5 different projects that they were doing with Capcom. So it's a great place to start if you are just kicking it off, and you don't have that sort of game in your mind that you want to build.
Yeah, and a mobile publisher who's a client of my firm, they fund entire projects for like 40-person teams this way from the start. That's sort of their model. We're going to fund your entire production, and the reason they like it is that as the game sort of evolves and changes, you don't necessarily have to redo your specifications and your milestones. You're paying the burn rate anyway, right? You're paying for the whole studio. So it's easier for the game to sort of evolve on the fly, which is why they like it.
Yeah, the fact that you don't have to have all the milestone deliverables exactly defined is really beneficial. It allows you to sort of go, I think, the rate in which modern day game development goes. Because back in my day, you'd have you got to do these 10 things to get paid off, and then you're spending half of the month negotiating trade-offs of like, well, I didn't get 4 models done, but we got 4 extra screens done, so can we trade that? And that's just a waste of time, right? I mean, if you're just moving forward and there's trust built, then these deals are a lot better than the milestone-based stuff, because you don't have to have that horse trading. Because usually the producer that's handling your project from the publishing side has never made a game on their own in their lives, and so they don't know what the hell they're doing, usually. And so you can't really trust them to know how you're going to be able to support a team of 60 or 80 people.
So talking about that sort of trust milestone, if
Sure.
you're in a situation, where you haven't established that sort of rapport yet.
Yeah.
How do you, if your client is a publisher who's approaching a developer with this kind of a burn rate deal, and they're, anxious about getting involved in it because, we don't know what we're looking at. We have this full visibility. They're the ones who are intimately familiar with the project, and we're noticing the cost slowly doing this.
Yeah.
But we're not seeing any greater return on that.
You're saying that if you're choosing this deal versus milestone?
A burn rate deal, and basically you're covering all their costs, but for reasons that the publisher doesn't understand, the developer keeps saying, oh yeah, our costs went up again.
Yeah.
But I'm not seeing anything.
Yeah, that's, I think, a good example of really bad day-to-day management, right? If you don't have visibility of the work that's everyone's been doing, and that's, I think, what we've done in the past of like, hey, you have access to the source code, so you know exactly when people are checking in and checking out. We have sort of like online so they can see when they're live on Skype, and so it's almost like a time card system. Because this has sort of been so much of our business historically, companies tend to respect us for that, but somebody building it from scratch, you need to build that. Say, hey, you have access to our bug database, access to our source code, you guys can see all the work we're doing. If at any time you think that one task or another task isn't being done in a timely manner, let us know. But it is about building that trust. And my perspective is always like, if they don't trust you, then overdo it, right? Be like, hey, let's do daily calls. just like, let's jam on tasks. We'll give you guys progress reports on a daily basis. If you're not happy with that for a couple, let's just do that for a couple weeks. If that makes it better, then maybe let's do that weekly and then monthly to sort of build that trust. Because out the gate, it's really important that when you hear a signal from your business partner, like a publisher, that they're worried, jump on that. Don't be like, man, we're going to figure it out. Or they're being overly cautious and like, yeah, they are. Because they're probably publicly traded. It's kind of a big deal.
That's important in every one of these deal structures, but probably more important in this kind, right?
Over communicate.
These deals work best, in my opinion, when the publisher has really good producers on the project and works really closely with the developer, rather than the ones where you're getting a monthly milestone and somebody is just checking off a box. So we delivered this, 1 playable level, 2 new characters, here the design Bible, whatever. This one, they're embedded with you guys, so to avoid that exact problem, right? But it's also one of the problems I think that developers don't necessarily understand when they see these deals. They go, "Oh, great, you're going to cover our costs. That's a blank check.
Yeah.
Right? We get to keep going forever and ever."
And don't try to double dip. Don't try to put one person that you're charging on 2 different things. That is a disaster, because then you're basically lying. Even though it doesn't maybe say contractually, like if they're doing 2 40-hour projects at the same time and you haven't been clear with your partner on that, that is bad business.
Because
and that
in
will
these
bite
deals,
your
they're going to know. In the burn rate deals, they're going to find that out, and then they're going to feel like you're screwing them. So
yeah. The best is, so there is scenarios though where like you come across a problem where you can't progress, and that's where I always say like check in twice a day, like we're stuck by this, we're stuck by this, we're stuck by this, we're stuck by this. And if they're like we got it, we know, then you're like okay, we're doing our best. That's I think really important. And also I think in these situations, if you do start to see at a macro level waste, proactively going to the partner saying, hey, I'm noticing that we probably could be changing this thing and this thing to make it a little bit better, and they go, we know that, but we're okay with sort of the project being 20% more expensive. Okay. But that's sort of our commitment as sort of the business leaders of the company to sort of give them that feedback.
And these deals are easily terminated. The agreements, again, if they're funding the whole thing, they have the ability to say stop. I mean, again, it's a time and materials deal, sort of on its at its core.
You should just be the prorated current.
Yeah, you're not getting as much of a sort of severance package on that. And this is also not to say that there's not milestones and sort of check-in points in these deals. They're just not predicated to payment. There might be 3 or 4 ones across the entire spectrum that say, okay, at alpha, you're still going to submit an alpha, and it's still going to get reviewed, and they're going to decide if they want to keep going on the burn, right? But these deals, I think, depending on the 2 parties involved, which goes back to our earlier slide or one of our first slides about sort of knowing your project, knowing what you're good at, knowing what you need. If you know that you're sort of set up well for this and you're ready to collaborate in a certain way, these deals are actually pretty good.
Yeah, I think they're good on a short term, but as far as building long-term value, they're not, right? Yeah. Because if you're trying to build IP and participate in revenue and have ongoing revenue and stuff like that, this is not the way to do it. These are good stopgaps. And this is from our perspective at Iron Galaxy, it's more about building a portfolio. So like at any one time, 30 to 60% is this kind of stuff, and then the rest of it is, more of that participation or own IP stuff. There's a question over there.
So I have a question going back to the traditional publisher model, and I guess it applies to this too, but like if you have breach, a situation where there's breach and they want to back out or they want to not have a deal anymore, what happens to the IP? Like, can the developer continue work if they can find other funding? Like, or is the publisher like, no, we own that too, you don't get anything now, you have to walk away?
That's a great question. We're covering that a little bit in the next presentation, but it really depends on sort of who owns the IP coming out of the gate in that. Usually it's going to be the publisher. And if the publisher says the developer is in breach and terminates because of the developer's breach, publisher owns that IP. Developer cannot work on that IP again.
And smothers it slowly with a pillow over 10 years as it does nothing. They can always
try to buy it back, but if you're terminating for breach, it means there was a problem in the relationship anyway. They're not going to be too open to that call. So
that covers everything. When you say like the IP, that covers not just like maybe the identifiable things, but like the source code and anything that you contributed toward that project. That is also owned under IP. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
If you didn't declare it as separate source code that you had sort of previously owned or built, then
you can't like reskin the game and be like, oh yeah, it was Sour Patch.
So
now it's
technically you can't. However, most publishers in that scenario do open their hearts, to say, hey, listen, you guys have done this work, and it's, we own it. Sometimes they'll allow you to buy it all back, or sell it to somebody else, because then they get their money recouped, or some of it at least. It's not just a complete loss. But sometimes they'll be like, hey, listen, you guys can take not the skins or the characters, but like you guys can take the underlying technology and go and do your own thing. Usually they'll do that.
Usually the contract will allow that the developer owns the pre-existing tools and technology that are sort of independent of this particular IP or this particular game, and they can use that after the fact to do what they do. If they're traditionally make racing games and then they've got some really cool tools, some physics tools or whatever, they're going to continue to make racing games, right? But anything that's particular to this, I don't know, science fiction based racing game will be owned by.
I would not sign that.
Right. That's why I'm not in game development. But usually the publisher will own that. And again, it sort of depends on the contract. There are buyback provisions that are negotiated specifically in. There are situations in all of these types of deals where the developer can retain ownership of the IP. So in that case, it's a lot cleaner. The developer then just go ahead and continue to make the game on their own if they want. They can use that severance fee if it's an at-will termination, and they can go on and do it. So all of that tends to vary deal to deal, and it's negotiated.
Yeah, IP ownership in itself is a thing.
Yeah, and we'll talk about, Suzanne and I talk about that on the next panel. So we'll go into it a lot more. But again, there's a top new mobile game out there right now that was 100% created on a burn rate deal by a client of mine, and I think this deal can work really well. But by the same token, that same client has done 3 deals with a developer on a burn rate basis and canceled each one of them, but they keep going back to them and saying, okay, how about let's do something new and different. So it's a hard one to get.
Fool me once, shame on you.
Yeah, I know. I've mentioned that phrase exactly to the client, but they keep going back. They said, there's something good there, and there's a good collaboration. But at the end of the day, at those certain checkpoints, they just didn't see the game that they liked, that they thought was going to monetize. So they pulled the plug and they said, okay, come back to us when you have another concept. But these deals are out there either on a stopgap basis, or a few people are dabbling with them on a full studios basis with some development teams. And
I would not do that deal. Yeah. From a development perspective, as a developer, I mean, putting 120 people at just a burn rate where they can cancel at any time, that's sort of where I think where it works well on smaller scales.
Yeah.
But if that's what you got to do.
Yeah. No, they definitely haven't done it on 120, but a small mobile game.
Yeah,
15, 20 people. I think it's something to pay attention to. And again, you have to have the right producers. You have to have the right level of oversight, and
and the right margin built in, right?
Yes, the right margin built in on both sides. And they actually have a pretty good on those deals. They actually have a pretty good back end percentage breakout, which I don't know if it's going to get there.
I'm more interested now.
Yeah, we'll talk. So these deals are out there. They're certainly not as common, but they're out there, and they're good for certain things. These are development fee and financing hybrids. I'm seeing a good amount of these in the last couple of years, and I don't know why they started, but I think it's more because of the post-launch components of a game. But basically, it's a publisher saying, we're going to give you a development fee in the traditional or break-even model, and on top of that, we're going to buy 20% of your company. We're going to give, we're going to do a Series A. So a lot of the Asian publishers have gone this route in the last few years. I personally think it's because it's hard to unwind these deals post-launch, and they want to be in business with you and make sure you're doing your job on the leaderboards and sort of the live ops side of things. So I think that's their way to keep their hooks into the developer rather than have just a contractual relationship. They have a seat on your board, things along those lines. But regardless, these deals are interesting. They're certainly out there. We've got. I just finished up on where a client bought. Where a client sold 30% of their company to a Chinese publisher that was giving them a sort of time and materials deal. So on top of that, they said, we like the work you're doing. We think there's a lot more potential with your studio, and we're going to do a Series A on top of it. So
Yeah, it's happened a ton, right? I mean, Digital Extreme, Studio Wildcard, a bunch of studios over in, I think, Splash Damage, Sumo. It's sort of the new norm in a weird way. I think most of it is the FOMO clause, right? If you become the next Mojang or Psyonix or Riot or Bungie and we didn't have 20% of it, then you're going to look like an idiot. And so I feel like a lot of it's that, and you usually can get studios when they're not looking to acquire a lot. Usually it's 10, 20, 30% of the studio. But from their perspective, it's like that's sort of probably a cheap investment. If they're already also funding the game, then obviously they're sort of hedging against that they believe in you in the short term. So obviously there's downside. Do you have a question?
How do other publishers feel about working with a company that's 20% owned by the competitor?
That's a great question.
that's one of the disadvantages. Other publishers are less likely to work with you.
Yeah, that's a conversation that if you're going down that road, obviously you need to be super clear, and especially if they're competitors, could get potentially ugly. In our line of work, where we do mostly work for hire, it gets really, really complicated because there could be like previous partnerships or relationships with different ones. So there's a lot of sort of politicking and ensuring that it's not going to. Because if we did that, let's say we did that, Iron Galaxy sold 10% to a company tomorrow, and it's going to cut off 40% of our partners from working with us. Well, we should not do that deal. So it's very, very important to be transparent, and then oftentimes with that transparency, your other partners will be like, oh, what's going on? What are you guys up to?
And it also depends on sort of the investors and the other publishers you're thinking about working with. EA might not care. EA might not care if Tencent owns 20% of you in China, but they're certainly going to care if Activision owns 20%.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to sort of look at that. And companies like Tencent love these kinds of deals, right? They're seeding money all over the place so they can be an investor in the next Riot, right? So they do these deals fairly often. I've done a couple on the developer side opposite them. So these deals happen pretty often. But again, you have to be careful and you have to understand what you're going to be doing 2 years down the road. Yeah.
They sometimes include further investing rights matching or opportunities to invest further under circumstances, even to the point of control.
Yes, almost always. The typical Series A ability is to buy more or first and last on new ownership percentages and all the typical things that you'd have in that drag tag provisions and all that stuff, protective covenants and whatnot.
Is it to a control point? Because I've usually heard that it's usually below that because they don't want. I mean, if they're believing in the vision of the company, then they don't necessarily want.
I've seen both.
Okay.
Right? So, some of them are to the control point. The one I just did was 30% with an ability to go up to 70%. So and their option to buy up to 40% more with a timeline on that particular one.
Yeah.
But it's not just sitting out there. They've either got to sort of commit or not commit within a certain period of time on that. But yeah, those that's normally what they're going to demand. Yeah.
What kind of budget range do you usually see for this model of business as far as the overall budget for a project?
The budget for the project remains the same. It's not. It's still sort of anywhere from $0 to $50-70 million. It's not really dependent on that. It's just a question of how much what's that?
You see it for smaller ones. Is kind of my question.
No,
not as much.
I don't see. I see them for mid-size and up. Right. I'd say I don't think I've seen one. I don't think I've seen one for under $5 or $7 million.
Okay.
Yeah. But certainly, anything up around 10%. I'm sorry, 10 million or so. I think the publishers are going to be thinking, how do I not just finance this game? How do I get in business with these guys long term if we're going to commit that kind of resource to them? And this is one of the ways they do it.
The strangest thing I'm finding is that the mainstream publishers, the traditional publishers, aren't really doing this. And I don't know why. Because if this is the new norm and they're publicly traded, they're interested in sort of great growth in the future, it's kind of strange to me that they aren't. But it doesn't seem to be their interest.
It tends to be a lot of the Asian publishers doing this, to be honest, and not really sort of the U.S.-based publishers. And I don't necessarily know why. It seems like they're going to get boxed out if they don't do more of this.
Yeah. You had a question there.
Yeah. So similar to what you said, they'll buy 20% of our company, but that'll alienate 40% of our partners.
Yeah.
Like you were saying, EA doesn't care about Tencent. They care a lot about Activision.
Yeah.
If you're a smaller company and this is, and for whatever reason, the first deal you're going to get is a dev fee financing hybrid because some publisher comes along and says, for whatever reason, we're really hooked on whatever it is you're working on, we want in.
Actually, just have with Kerbal. Kerbal Space Program just got bought.
Yeah.
And that was their first project. That was a that's a good one.
Great example.
Yeah.
So if you're them and
Yeah.
you're looking at the market of who would be interested in us,
Yeah.
it's that marrying on the first date thing. How
Yeah.
much deep diving would you recommend that developer do before agreeing to that? It's because
That's a great question.
Look into a crystal ball and see in 5 years will EA want in, so I shouldn't accept Activision.
And depending on how much Shark Tank you've watched, it's
right. I was
like
gonna say, like how much you've been binging it, like when the developer calls you.
that's a really great question. That's tough. It's a friend of mine once said, if you see an offer for more money than you've ever understood in your life, you should take it. And I don't necessarily agree all the time. But that's sort of to each what journey they're on and what their goal is, right? That's the biggest thing I often ask developers. What's your goal with your studio?
Yeah.
Right? Is it to, when Dave Lang started Iron Galaxy, his goal was to create a company that everyone could retire from. That's sort of the value that he started as. But many other people I want to build these 3 games that I have in my brain, or I want to be independent wealthy. Like a lot of the studios I talk about in my talk, they've gone on to basically within their first game, some of them even within the first day of sales of the first game, fund in the next 5 years of their studio. And so it all depends on what they're trying to do. But chances are, if it's a really lucrative deal, you could make some calls, like you want to make them sweat a little bit, be like, hey, give me 72 hours to think about it, and then voraciously phone other people, but usually take it. But the challenge is, I think this is when we talk about the disadvantages, that it seems great, it seems amazing. If anyone's interested in buying some of our company, that seems awesome. But you haven't even made a game together, so you don't even know what they're good at. And so you're automatically going from like Tinder, I swiped right and all of a sudden I'm in business together forever, right? That's kind of a big deal.
What I mentioned also goes the other way, right? You're the developer and you don't know how this publisher is going to interact, suddenly owning part of your company, and now you find yourself, under a dictatorial regime.
Yeah,
right.
You don't know.
And they're all going to say, no, we don't do that.
We don't do that.
We leave
it's
you alone.
great. It's the best.
We just want to be in business with you.
It's the best. We have the greatest company ever.
Right?
No problems
until they're
ever.
on your board, right?
Yeah.
And it might
they're
not
like,
be
actually, Adam.
we don't want you to work on this. We want you to do we want you to do a match 3 puzzle game. And all of a sudden, it's not what you signed up for.
It's always going to have downsides. So it's a matter of just like weighing the pros and cons, talking to other people that have worked with that partner. That's the most important thing. Like ensuring that you inform yourself as much as humanly possible. That's a big thing. We've sort of like, since I joined Iron Galaxy, we're sort of going through every single aspect of our business, whether it's our internet provider or 401k provider. We've basically been shark tanking like new people to come in and be like, are you doing the best for us? And that's really important, I think, of like looking at all your options. We're calling a lot of the people in the industry, be like, what are you guys doing? What's your best practice? Stuff like that. So that's super important when it looks like that. But because it is to a young studio, this looks pretty awesome. But 5 years in, it's like your hands are sort of cuffed, and you're like, what have we done? We don't work for ourselves anymore, right? Luckily, with a small minority ownership, you probably still have a little bit more of that control. But.
Well, a client of ours, they spun out of a very, very large company and a very large franchise. And they set up shop, and they had this great idea for a game that they wanted to do. And a publisher came to them with this model and said, we love your game, we want to do a dev fee, and we also want, we want 20% of you. And they said, no, that's not what we're looking for. You don't have to take this deal.
Yeah.
That publisher doesn't only offer this deal. And they downshifted from this into just a plain break-even model, right? So they convinced them, they said, let's see how we work together first. We're going to be pretty integrated anyway. We're a one-team studio. You are 100% of our cash flow. If you want to come back, and if it's better to buy into our company or buy our company in general than to pay us the royalty that we think we're gonna make, then we'll have that conversation 2 years from now.
It kind of goes to the because oftentimes they'll say, well, it'll be harder then for us to invest later. I'm like, no, not at all.
It'll just be more money.
When Rocket League came out and sort of just hockey stick growth, publishers will call me up and be like, so Adam, I'm like, every day you wait, their valuation is going to go up 15% every single day. Now they're worth 50 million, now they're worth 100 million, now they're worth 150. Like now I think they're probably $500 million probably as a company. But that's the thing, is like making sure that if you're not happy with it, you can wait, you can try it out, because that way you're building that relationship. It's just kind of like first right of refusal. I think they're bullshit. Here's why. If you have a bad relationship with somebody, you're not going to want to do the next one. Neither are they. So why put that in a contract? If it's going really well, you're going to want to do the next one together. right? So why do you have to put that in a contract to force that second round of marriage, right? So in this case scenario, I think if you can afford to, and if it isn't important to you to sell part of that and create that extra cash flow, some people might see it as a growth catalyst of like, hey, I need to build this one part of my business. I need to hire 8 people. So this is a great cash flow influx so I can sort of build that team. But if you don't need that, then I think it's always smarter to sort of date before you marry. Yeah.
2 quick points. So the second one, the developer can turn it around and offer the publisher an opportunity to invest on terms agreed on in advance. And can say, well, this is where we think we're going to go, so we're going to do this now, but we'll offer you these options.
Yeah.
Perhaps at a certain valuation at certain times.
Yeah.
I'm assuming a positive rate, and that way they can see how it goes.
Yeah.
Have options and all that. And the first thing, I think that my experience is that a lot of Chinese companies are following that model about investing in companies in broad rate. I think one of the big differences is that they don't have the same type of public company regulations.
Yeah.
Things that go on here. So if a big publisher here is taking equity, it's on their balance sheet. It's a part of every acquisition they do. It's part of other investments. It's complicated.
Yeah. It's also offshoring cash and stuff like that investment. Yeah.
They don't. It actually carries with them certain difficulties that it's messy.
Yeah.
For many companies, and that's probably why they don't do that as readily.
Right.
Chinese companies don't have to worry about.
Yeah. It's a good point.
Yeah. Any other questions on this type of deal, on this type of arrangement? And then the last one, which is pretty simple, it's just a pure financing without the publishing obligation. This generally tends to happen when a publisher says to the developer, we want to be in business with you no matter what you're doing because you're a rock star, right? You've made this great game, you've made this great franchise. So here's some money, continue to make games, and we just want to fund, you use it however you see fit. We don't even necessarily have the right to publish that game. You can publish it somewhere else. They're rare, but they occur. And again, I think Tencent has been a very strong purveyor of this. I've done some of these on behalf of our clients on that as well. The advantage is there's no creative oversight, right? On the game production side, they're just giving you money and you use it however you see fit for your company operations. There's corporate oversight, and they're going to have a board seat depending on the percentages and that they buy into and all that. But on the game production, they're not as involved.
Yeah, this is pretty rare. This is usually for the bigger companies like Epic, Bonfire, which we mentioned earlier. That's for more on spec stuff. But Epic's like, hey, you got a great business model. You're making a lot of money. We want to be a part of that, which is great. But as a studio, I would see, from my perspective, the developers I've talked to, this is relatively rare because if they're not like going to participate in a game that you're making, like this would totally make sense for Bungie, something like that, some big scale studio. But it's more rare, I think, on the smaller scale.
And the implication, even though the publisher that's investing in you, you don't have to go to them to publish the game when the game's done. Implication is you're probably going to go there because when you have a board meeting and you say, well, what should we do as far as our options, that member of your board is going to say, why don't we talk to our guys? So
I know a guy.
Yeah, I happen to know a publisher.
He's my boss.
Right. And everybody has a boss, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And so you're ultimately probably going to end up working with them anyway. And if you're not, that's kind of a different problem because that means they don't really like your game that they've invested in your company on. But you have all the same issues that you had in the hybrid model. Will this preclude you from working with certain publishers? And the answer is yes. Again, if Tencent's seeding you to 10 to 20%, it's not going to preclude Ubisoft from working with you or anybody else. But it will preclude other Chinese companies potentially from approaching on some stuff. So it's all the same issues with the hybrid model, and it's just a little bit harder to find because it seems like there's no strings attached in these deals, but there are.
Also, from a studio perspective, you usually want this only if you're looking to exit some owners or, like I talked about, grow the company in some new way or fashion. If you need that capital inflection, I think. If you didn't need any of those things, you're just like trying to keep on keeping on, then this one isn't as interesting. Especially because chances are if you don't have a really amazing, huge game that's done well, they're going to get a great value on, obviously their investment. And that isn't necessarily usually want to be bought when you're the most expensive. not the cheapest. And so that's, I think, an important thing to keep in mind.
Any questions on that?
This one, it was popular 5 years ago.
Yes. So this one I think is still interesting. Obviously, crowdfunding and publishing hybrid. So everybody knows how the crowdfunding model works, whether it's Kickstarter or Fig or whatever.
So actually, I want to stop it right there, because most people don't.
Okay.
Okay? Most people don't understand how they work, right? First of all, you're going to take in money, right? You're basically pre-selling your game for full price. So let's say I'm going to pre-sell my game. It's $20. So I'm going to sell it. You get a copy of my game for $20. Boom. Then Kickstarter takes their fee, right? 1.5% to 3%, depending on it's Indiegogo, Kickstarter, all that stuff. Then you usually have to have a physical something. You're going to give a T-shirt away as well. So then you got to manufacture those. You got to source those. You got to ship those. Then you're going to be paying 30% or whatever the market rate is for the different Steam and PlayStation, Xbox. So now you're down to not a lot of money. So by the end of the time when you do that model, most people think it's free money. I'm just pre-selling my game. Bullshit. Not true at all. You are selling your game at a high discount. Sometimes you might need that capital influx, but there is a lot of strings attached to those things. And then there's the timeline. Then there's they're managing every person that put in money that thinks that they're a designer in your game. Anyway, I just want to make sure, because many people are like, these are easy to understand. I'm like, most people, once they get into it, are like, yeah, I could get free money on Kickstarter, and then it's like your dreams get crushed.
Yeah, and that's in a full Kickstarter or a full crowdfunding. So what we're talking about here is crowdfunding to a point, right?
Yeah.
And then at that point, if you prove that and if it hits a target and shows that there's a consumer demand for it, then the publisher comes in and says, I'll do a traditional or I'll do a break-even deal on the rest of it, right? I have a client that did this basically. The publisher funded the demo. I don't know, call it $500,000 or so. The demo went in as the Kickstarter, basically as part of the campaign. They tried to raise, another $1 million. And the publisher said, if it hits $1 million, we'll put in another 3. And it hit it. It hit it on the last day, but it hit it. So now they've got consumer demand. They've got a community that's been talking about it, and they $1 million less than they probably needed to fund from the publisher side. But then the question comes on the deal: who's in charge of the fulfillment? Right? Is it the publisher? Is it the developer? How does that work? But from a publisher perspective, I thought this was a nice, interesting deal because they only spent $500,000 to see if there was a good consumer market or visibility for this game, and they didn't have any commitment beyond that. Really, ultimately, it's probably not that different if in a traditional model if they just had an ability to pull the plug at that point, except they had sort of consumer feedback in there. So
yeah, I think that's the challenge, that the promise that you're making and how clear you are with the intent of what you're trying to do. We ran into this with Shenmue when we brought it up on stage at PlayStation to announce the Kickstarter. We were very clear that we're helping them because we are fans of what they are doing. I think a lot of people misconceive that we were the publisher of it. Not the case. They were self-publishing, but we were fans on the promotional, and we were sort of going to support them from a promotional perspective. So we had to sort of like clarify a lot and sort of post-event media stuff just to clarify. But that's really important, and the challenge is the more you try to be clear, the more it muddies the water, and then people start to be like, well, you guys just want this money to prove a point, or there's other secret investors, so I don't want to. Because I think what most fans want is they want to know that their money is making something happen that would have never happened without their money. And as soon as you start being like, well, but if we get your money, then we can get other money, and this other person, this other guy. And then I knew this guy in Texas who's going to float another $5 million, and then we'll get it. That starts to muddy, especially as that story starts to unravel. Then the negative press, because you're kickstarting a game that is in early development or not developed at all, that means it's probably not coming out for 18 to 36 months. So you have to weather the storm. In a day and age now where we see games like Fallout 4 announced and 6 months later it's out, right? The old-fashioned way of announcing a game a year and a half or 2 years before is kind of gone. And so if you have to weather the storm not only from developing a game, but also the public outcry or feedback, you need a whole PR team sort of assigned to it. So there definitely is benefits because you're right, Patrick, you get to sort of prove the marketplace and the passion for it. But so many people have been burned by bad ones. And Star Citizen is still making, what are they, over 80, 90 million now?
Yeah.
So they're doing incredibly well. But the new people, I think now, because there's been so many failures in this space, it makes it infinitely harder for anyone to come along. Because even if you have a great idea, people are going to be skeptical because they're like, why can't you just get other money? Because it seems like you're ripping us off.
Yeah, and if you're going to unwind this from a publisher-developer perspective, you can't just walk away in the quote-unquote traditional sense because you've already got a bunch of backers who are like, hey, where's my game? Whose fault is it? Somebody screwed up here. And both sides are going to go, no, and they're going to do it publicly and visibly. So.
Yeah, an interesting alternative is Fig, which is one where you can actually invest and participate in the revenue for the back end. So that's sort of a newer model that launched from a bunch of guys from Double Fine and some other companies. So that's sort of a crowdfunding model where at least if you're putting money in, enough money, you get sort of a allocation of revenue on the back end.
Right, not just a pre-sale.
Yeah, not just a pre-sale. So, but I think this one is always one that you approach with caution because you only get one shot to do something great. And if it doesn't come out and doesn't do well on the Kickstarter, then if you were going to do that and then pitch it to publishers based on the success and it doesn't succeed, your game is dead, basically. Because if you go and like, our Kickstarter raised $35,000, then every publisher can be like, that's a joke, please get out.
Well, I think the overriding theme of sort of all these models is you start out with what was sort of tried and true and what was sort of the norm, and each one of them gets inherently more creative, right?
Yeah.
And it's the publishers trying to say, okay, let's try to do something different because there's a lot of risk on the traditional model for the publishers and a lot of risk for the developers as well, and in the developer side, not a lot of reward. So it didn't always work for either party. So they started moving and trying to figure out a different way. And publishers, particularly the smaller to mid-sized ones, they don't have a problem getting creative, right? It's the ones that are sort of big and set in their ways, that aren't. Activision isn't going to do this deal, right? They have models when if they're doing third-party development deals, they know how they want it to work. They're going to come to you and say, this is how it works, and you're not going to be able to suggest to them, well, why don't we do this hybrid? No, this is how we're going to do it. But other publishers that are sort of competing more for the small to mid-level projects are willing to get creative, and one of those. Did exactly this, and I think it was publicly announced. But this is 505 did this one or did one of these that I know of, and they were looking to do others that were similar to it. So it sort of depends on the publisher that you're approaching, but the way we presented these slides is sort of getting more creative as the presentation goes on.
But I think that's a great point, Patrick, is that nowadays, if you're not looking at the major publishers, everyone's open for business. And so if you go in there with a bunch of creative ideas of like, hey, let's move this style here. What if we give you guys better rights in Latin America, or different sort of, if you're doing popular, doing great over there, or another region means a lot to them, or merchandising rights mean, like, using all of those things I have found is the best way, because then it looks like you care. It's kind of like, I liken it to applying for a job. We've been having some job openings lately, and people just like apply with a horrible cover letter that's written, and they think we're in the iron mining business, and they don't even read anything. But anyone that goes an extra mile, I got a resume yesterday, which was a guy that built a custom PlayStation cover with his name on the top and a whole thing. I'm like, that means that you want to do business. It means that you care about this partnership and what you're doing. And so the more creative you can be, and the more open you are to trying different things and changing those dials, the more the publisher can be like, hey, these people, not only are they great from a creative game perspective, but they're also creative from a business perspective and understand sort of the marketplace and what they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, you're showing your passion for the project by showing some creativity in the way you approach some of the deals.
It's really important to understand what's important to them, right? When you sit down at a table and start a relationship, like my boss used to use this awesome quote from PlayStation: what gets you your boat? I mean, he was usually talking to big executives, but like, how do they get paid? If you understand when you're negotiating with a publisher, whether they're biz dev person or like, understanding their compensation package is actually kind of important. If you know that they get bonuses and stuff like that, if they're incentivized by certain things or bigger revenue shares and stuff like that, then you can start to think like they think. And that's, I think, one of the most important things we started doing at PlayStation is, my rule was everyone that comes in the room, whatever's the most important to them in that moment is the most important thing to you in that moment, right? And that's, I think, thinking like them is really important, because oftentimes you're like, we just want money. How can we get money? It's like, no, think like they think. What's important to them? What's their portfolio strategy? What kinds of games are they trying to sign? What size of games are they trying to sign? Making sure that you ask as many questions in the sort of first discussion is super important.
And that's all
Cool,
we have.
we got a question in the
Yeah, we
back.
have questions.
I'm a VR indie developer, and I was wondering if there's been any changes in any of these models, or anything that's happened for VR versus, I guess, the way the industry has been traditionally, because not a lot of people are making money in VR, and obviously there's a lot of projections, and they don't know where everything's going to shake out, and whatever. So how's that?
You know, the question, I don't know if everybody could hear it, the question was in VR, are any of the models different? I don't see it being a whole lot of different. They all sort of tend to fall in some of these buckets. My advice would be in VR, I wouldn't do a deal with your own money that's heavily based on the back end, because I just don't think it's there yet. You know, when Oculus had their launch titles, I think there was 30 of them, clients of ours were 3 of the 30, and those deals were pretty much a time and materials deal. They had a back end in there, but you know, there was no install base yet for that. So
And IP ownership is a lot more. They're a lot more. Sort of like.
They had to. They were sort of seeding for content. So
And because there's so many different companies, there has been and is looking for this content, that usually their terms are a lot more fair. They usually allow you to own your IP and stuff like that. But the challenge we have that industry faces, because we're doing some VR stuff as well, is that the funding tranches appear and then disappear, right? So it's like, okay, they have a fund, they have a $10 million fund to do stuff, and then blah, blah, that gets gobbled up in 6 months, or you weren't in the right sort of pipeline. So the challenge is these are sort of popping up and going away as quickly. So it's more opportunistic right now, and it's harder to find where those little gold mines are and how long they're gonna appear for. It's literally like a game of a countdown timer. As soon as the chest opens, you have 5 minutes to get there, and if not, it closes. So I think because they haven't figured out that longevity play of how do we create a longer term. So they're like, hey, they're thinking about product launches and how they create content to sort of exemplify those launches. And that doesn't make it very easy for a developer to get funding for those kind of things.
but when you find it, it tends to be sort of a break-even deal, like a milestone deliverable model. Yeah.
It's usually super fair.
Yeah.
Because there's so many people doing VR, and the terms that I've seen seem to be quite fair.
Yeah.
Other questions about any of it? Yeah.
Yeah, looking at the different models, I'm kind of curious, how does the backend change over time, like change with the different models?
Well, with the break-even and the traditional model, the back end doesn't change much. There's still costs that are baked in. The only question is where it comes out, where it gets recouped, whether it gets your percentage or break-even. So you're
Sometimes you can have tiers. But
there'll potentially be tiers, but they're effectively the same sort of scenario in both those structures. The burn rate deals tend to either not have a back end because you're making your money on the time and materials side of it. The Kickstarter hybrid model will have a back end similar to a break even or a traditional.
It also depends on IP ownership. If you own the IP, then it's going to be a slower recoup. If you don't, then it might be higher. So it's literally like dials, and every single deal is different depending on how much they recoup. If you want money early, then that's probably going to cost you in the long term. So it's really different.
The particulars are absolutely very deal to deal, but in general, the cost structure, the things that are going to come off the top are going to be somewhat similar across the board. Obviously, the pure financing deal, there is no back end. It doesn't really matter. But it's generally same idea, and each deal within that is sort of, as Adam said, there's sort of these dials and particularities. I think we have time for one more.
How do these deals change, and which would you say are the most common ones when you have now a third party who holds the IP, like say a comic book character that the game is based on, and then you have a game publisher, and then you have a game developer?
That's a good question. It doesn't change the model at all for any of these. It's just as another layer. Somebody's absorbing that cost for that license, usually the publisher. So that's a cost that's going to come off the top. On a break even or before there's any royalty share.
Yeah, there's sort of two scenarios there. Scenario one is IP holder goes to developer and they co-pitch a project to a publisher together, which is sort of a combination, which is I think all developers and gamers probably prefer. And then there is the way that the licensing world, I was literally at the licensing show 2 weeks ago, where licenses will go to publishers and try to be like, do a Deadpool deal with a publisher, and then the publisher still has to go find the developer. In that way, basically, they already pre-negotiated the terms, and that's pretty straightforward. They're going to pay that percentage of the MG them directly. I was actually also involved in the Spider-Man deal with Insomniac and PlayStation a little bit, as well as the Star Wars stuff. On the developer side, that's sort of up to negotiation. The publisher's going to want to also have, if you're approaching already with that IP holder, approaching a publisher, they're going to want to make sure that they're not paying too much of that. If that's sort of the overall, that might come out of your own as a developer, might come out of your own back end.
And I am seeing more IPs being sort of partnered up with the developer at an earlier stage now than I ever used to. I don't necessarily know why it's occurring that way, but traditionally the license holder would only go to the publishers because that's the only one who could write the check, really.
Yeah.
So.
But they usually aren't involved from a financial perspective,
Yeah.
the license holder, so they're purely looking for their minimum guarantee and their ongoing royalty and making those as high and as expensive as possible.
They don't necessarily care if the publisher and developer have a hybrid Series A relationship or not. They just want their money off the top.
About 4 years ago, Marvel used to brag that they've made more money in canceled games than they have in shipped games.
I believe that.
That was before they switched
I'm not sure
over.
that's something to brag about, but
They used
I
to.
believe it, yeah.
Now they're a lot better. They're totally changed. They're awesome now. But
I think that's all. Obviously, Adam and I will be around if you have any other questions. And I think 10-minute break.
10-minute break. We'll be back at 10:40.
cool.